February 19, 1942, Darwin, Australia. A 15-year-old boy stands on a cliff with his mother's makeup mirror, flashing playful signals to his friends across the harbor, completely unaware that Japanese bomber pilots circling 15,000 feet above are recording his exact position as confirmed friendly intelligence. Within hours, 188 enemy aircraft would use that very spot as their primary navigation reference point, unleashing more bombs on Darwin than fell on Pearl Harbor and killing 242 people in Australia's deadliest day of World War II. But here's what haunts historians to this day. Did an innocent child's game actually help guide one of the war's most devastating attacks? Or did desperate military planners simply see patterns where none existed? The air still smelled like burning oil and death. Smoke rose from the harbor in thick black columns that blocked out the morning sun. Pieces of ships floated in water that had turned dark with fuel. Bodies lay covered with white sheets along the docks. Just 3 hours ago, this had been a busy port city. Now it looked like the end of the world. This is the story of how a teenage boy's reckless act with a mirror led to one of World War II's most tragic misunderstandings. On February 19th, Darwin suffered the largest single attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australia. The numbers tell a horrifying story. 242 people died that morning. 8 ships sank to the bottom of the harbor. 23 aircraft were destroyed on the ground before pilots could even reach them. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but it changed Australia forever. The Japanese sent 188 aircraft in 2 massive waves. They dropped more bombs on Darwin than they had dropped on Pearl Harbor just 2 months earlier. The explosions could be heard 50 miles away. Windows shattered in homes across the entire city. The ground shook so hard that people thought it was an earthquake. When the bombers finally turned back toward the north, they left behind a city that would never feel safe again. But here is what made the attack so devastating. Despite having radar stations positioned along the coast, despite having trained coastal watchers scanning the horizons, despite having military intelligence officers analyzing every scrap of information from the Pacific, Darwin was caught completely unprepared. The military had all the tools they needed. They had technology. They had trained men, they had procedures and protocols. Yet somehow, on that bright Thursday morning, nobody saw it coming until the bombs were already falling. In the days before the attack, missionaries from the Dutch East Indies had sent urgent warnings. They reported massive Japanese fleet movements heading south. They saw aircraft carriers and battleships moving into position. They sent telegrams and radio messages begging someone to listen. But the military brass in their comfortable offices dismissed these reports. Civilians could not possibly understand what they were seeing, the officers said. These were probably just fishing boats or merchant vessels. Nothing to worry about. The same thing happened with reports from local fishermen. Men who had spent their entire lives on these waters noticed strange aircraft flying high overhead. They saw ships on the horizon that did not look like any Allied vessels. They tried to tell the authorities, but again, nobody listened. The experts knew better. The trained military minds had decided that Darwin was safe, that the Japanese were too busy elsewhere, that an attack this far south was impossible. This failure to listen, this absolute certainty that experts always know best, created the perfect conditions for disaster. While officers studied their maps and assured each other that everything was under control, the enemy was watching. While intelligence analysts wrote reports saying Darwin faced no immediate threat, Japanese pilots were taking photographs and making notes. While everyone who actually lived in Darwin and knew something was wrong got ignored, the attack plans were being finalized. Into this mess of military confusion and institutional arrogance came the most unlikely protagonist imaginable. His name was James Doolan, but everyone called him Jimmy. He was just 15 years old. He was not a soldier or a spy or anyone important. He was a bored schoolboy stuck in Darwin while his father served somewhere overseas in the war. Jimmy was the kind of kid who could not sit still, who always needed something to occupy his restless mind, who looked for adventure in the most ordinary places. Jimmy had no expertise in military matters. He had no training in intelligence work. He had never even fired a gun. What he did have was a fascination with Morse code and signaling. He had checked out every book on the subject from the small Darwin library. He practiced the dots and dashes until he could tap them out in his sleep. He dreamed of becoming a radio operator or maybe a Signal Corps soldier when he was old enough to enlist. For weeks before the attack, Jimmy had been teaching himself to signal using his mother's makeup mirror. It was a simple thing, just a circular compact mirror about 4.5 inches across with a shiny silver backing. But in Jimmy's hands, it became a tool for sending messages. He would angle it to catch the sun and flash the light on and off, creating patterns he imagined were secret codes. What Jimmy did not know, what nobody could have predicted, was that his innocent game had caught the attention of someone very dangerous. Japanese reconnaissance planes had been flying over Darwin for weeks, staying high enough that most people never even noticed them. These pilots were professionals, trained to spot anything unusual, anything that might provide useful intelligence. And they noticed something very strange. Every afternoon at the same time, from the same spot on the cliffs at East Point, there were regular flashes of light. To the Japanese observers, this could only mean one thing. Someone on the ground was sending signals. Someone was trying to communicate. In the fog of war, where every shadow might hide an enemy and every pattern might reveal a secret, these flashes looked like confirmation of what Japanese intelligence desperately wanted to believe. They had agents on the ground in Darwin. They had someone sending them information. Jimmy had no idea that his afternoon adventures were being watched and recorded. He had no idea that his position was being marked on enemy maps. He had no idea that professional military minds were analyzing his playful mirror flashes and seeing something that was never there. He was just a kid playing on a cliff, trying to signal his friends, trying to feel like he was part of something important. But in the twisted logic of war, his innocent hobby was about to become something far more terrible than anyone could imagine. Jimmy's mirror signaling had started back in December of 1941, right after Pearl Harbor changed everything. School had become boring and pointless, with half the teachers gone to war and most of the other kids evacuated south with their families. Jimmy's mother refused to leave. She said they had to stay for when his father came home on leave. So Jimmy found himself trapped in a city that felt emptier every day, with nothing to do and nobody to talk to except a few other boys whose families had also stayed behind. The mirror he used belonged to his mother. It was part of her powder compact, a Christmas gift from years ago when times were better. The mirror itself measured exactly 4.5 inches in diameter. It was circular and flat with a silver backing that caught sunlight like a tiny sun. Jimmy had borrowed it one afternoon without asking, promising himself he would return it before she noticed. That was 3 months ago. His mother never asked for it back. Maybe she had forgotten about it. Maybe she had other things to worry about. Jimmy had found the perfect spot for his signaling games on the cliffs at East Point. The location gave him a clear view of the harbor and the ocean beyond. More importantly, it gave him the right angle to catch the afternoon sun. He had figured out through trial and error that 4:15 in the afternoon was the perfect time. At that exact moment, the sun sat at 22 degrees above the western horizon. This angle let him create flashes of light that could be seen for incredible distances across the water. He had measured it once with his friend Tommy, who stood on the beach with a watch while Jimmy flashed signals from the cliff. Tommy could see the flashes clearly from 2 miles away. Later, they tried it with Tommy's older brother taking a boat out into the harbor. He reported seeing the signals from at least 15 nautical miles offshore. Jimmy felt proud of this discovery. His little mirror could send messages farther than he ever imagined possible. The Boy Scout handbook became his Bible for learning Morse code. He spent hours memorizing the patterns. 3 short flashes meant the letter S. 3 long flashes meant O. He practiced until his arm ached from holding the mirror at the right angle. He practiced until he could send his name without even thinking about the pattern. He practiced because it made him feel useful in a world where a 15-year-old boy could do nothing to help win the war. On January 10th, 1942, Jimmy tried his first real long-distance signal. He saw a fishing boat way out past the harbor entrance. The boat looked tiny from his cliff, just a dark speck on the bright water. Jimmy decided to send a message. He carefully flashed out what he thought spelled "Hello, mate" in Morse code. He was so focused on getting the timing right between the dots and dashes that he did not notice his mistake. He actually sent a garbled mess of random flashes that meant nothing at all. But to him, standing on that cliff with the sun warm on his face and the wind in his hair, it felt like he had accomplished something important. What Jimmy did not know was that his signals had already been noticed by eyes far more dangerous than friendly fishermen. Japanese reconnaissance flights had been passing over Darwin since early January. These were not the massive bomber formations that would come later. These were single aircraft flying at extreme altitude, so high that they left only thin white contrails across the blue sky. Most people in Darwin never even looked up to see them, but the pilots in those planes saw everything. They had cameras that could photograph the entire harbor from 6 miles up. They had trained observers who noted every ship, every building, every possible military target. And they noticed something very strange. Starting in mid-January, their reports began mentioning regular light signals from a coastal position at East Point. The signals appeared almost every clear afternoon at approximately the same time. The pattern was too regular to be accidental reflection. Someone on the ground was deliberately sending flashes of light. In the Japanese Navy offices aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, intelligence officers studied these reports with growing interest. They had been planning an attack on Darwin for weeks. The port was important. Allied ships used it to move supplies and troops. American aircraft staged through Darwin on their way to fight in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. Destroying Darwin would cut a vital link in the Allied supply chain, but the Japanese had very little information about the defenses. They did not know where anti-aircraft guns were positioned. They did not know how many fighter planes protected the city. Every scrap of intelligence was precious. The reports of light signals seemed too good to be true. Could they really have an agent on the ground? Someone signaling them with information? The Japanese intelligence officers wanted desperately to believe it. In war, people see what they want to see. They took Jimmy's random mirror flashes and built an entire story around them. They marked his exact position on their tactical maps. They labeled it as a confirmed friendly signal station. They began to think of that spot on the cliff as a reference point, a known location they could use to orient their attack. By late January, more reports came in. The signals had not stopped. In fact, there seemed to be multiple signals now. Jimmy had taught his friends the basics of mirror signaling. Tommy had found an old hand mirror in his grandmother's things. Another boy named Peter used a piece of polished metal from his father's workshop. On sunny afternoons, the three of them would stand in different spots and flash messages back and forth. They invented codes and played games of signal tag. They pretended to be spies sending secret messages. It was harmless fun for bored teenagers, but from 6 miles up, it looked like something completely different. It looked like a coordinated network. It looked like multiple agents working together. It looked like exactly the kind of ground intelligence that would make an attack much easier to plan and execute. On February 15th, just 4 days before the attack, Japanese planners finalized their bombing run coordinates. They marked the East Point area as a primary visual reference. Pilots were instructed to use that coastal position to orient themselves before beginning their attack runs into the harbor. Jimmy kept signaling, completely unaware. He flashed his mirror on February 16th. He flashed it again on February 17th. The weather on February 18th was cloudy, so he stayed home and read magazines. He had no idea that hundreds of miles to the north, Japanese pilots were climbing into their cockpits. He had no idea that they carried maps with his clifftop position marked in red ink. He had no idea that his innocent game was about to become part of something terrible. The next morning, those pilots would use his spot on the cliff as their navigation reference to unleash the most devastating attack Australia had ever seen. Before February 19, Japanese raids on Allied positions in the Pacific had relied almost entirely on aerial reconnaissance with no help from the ground. Pilots flew over their targets, took photographs, studied maps, and hoped for the best. They had no way to know for certain which buildings held ammunition and which held food supplies. They could not tell military barracks from civilian housing from the air. They had to guess where anti-aircraft guns might be hidden. This uncertainty meant their bombs often missed the most important targets. They would destroy empty warehouses while fuel depots sat untouched just a few hundred yards away. The attack on Darwin was different. The Japanese pilots came in with confidence they had never felt before. They knew exactly where they were going. As the first wave of bombers approached the Australian coast that Thursday morning, the lead pilots looked down and found their reference point immediately. The cliff at East Point stood out clearly in the early light. That was where the signals had come from. That was their confirmed friendly position. From that single point, they could orient themselves perfectly. Every other target in the harbor could be measured and found based on distance and direction from that cliff. The results were devastating. The first bombs fell at exactly 9:58 in the morning. Within minutes, the harbor had become an inferno. The oil storage tanks at Stokes Hill Wharf, positioned in a direct line from Jimmy's signaling point, took multiple direct hits. 45,000 gallons of fuel oil exploded in a fireball that could be seen 20 miles away. The blast was so powerful it broke windows in buildings half a mile from the waterfront. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, turning morning into twilight across the entire city. Ship after ship went down in the harbor. The USS Peary, an American destroyer, took 5 direct bomb hits and sank in just 3 minutes. 33 sailors went down with her, trapped below decks with no chance to escape. The Australian hospital ship Manunda took 19 hits, even though it was clearly marked with red crosses. 12 nurses and medical staff died at their posts, trying to save wounded patients. The transport ship Neptuna, loaded with 200 depth charges, exploded with such force that pieces of the ship landed more than a mile away. The blast created a crater on the seafloor that is still visible today. The accuracy was unlike anything seen before in the Pacific War. Japanese bombers achieved a 95% hit rate on military targets in Darwin Harbor that morning. In previous raids on other Allied ports, their accuracy had been closer to 60%. That 35% improvement meant the difference between a damaging raid and complete devastation. Every bomb that hit its intended target was a bomb that did not fall harmlessly into the ocean or into empty fields. Every accurate strike meant more ships sunk, more aircraft destroyed, more lives lost. The second wave came at noon, targeting the airfield. Again, the pilots used the East Point Cliff as their reference marker. They found the runway with ease. 23 aircraft sat lined up on the ground, easy targets painted bright in the tropical sun. Within 10 minutes, every single one had been destroyed. Bombs cratered the runway in 16 places, making it impossible for any surviving aircraft to take off or land. The control tower collapsed into rubble. The fuel depot burned for 3 days straight. But the Japanese were not finished with Darwin. They came back again and again over the next 21 months. 64 more air raids struck the city between February 1942 and November 1943. Some were small, just a few planes dropping bombs and leaving. Others were massive strikes with dozens of aircraft. Through all of these attacks, Japanese pilots continued to use that same coastal reference point. The cliff at East Point appeared on their maps for raid after raid. Even when the targets changed, even when they bombed different parts of the city, they still oriented themselves from that one spot where they believed their agent had sent signals. The Allies tried everything to stop the attacks. They set up decoy lights in the desert, hoping to draw bombers away from the real city. The Japanese ignored them and went straight for Darwin every time. They tried false signal lights, flashing random patterns from different locations to confuse enemy pilots. It did not work. The bombers still found their targets with terrible accuracy. They enforced strict blackout protocols, making sure not a single light showed after dark. But most raids came in daylight when blackouts meant nothing. In March of 1942, Jimmy's family finally evacuated south to Adelaide. His mother had waited as long as she could, hoping for news from his father, but after the bombing, she could not justify staying any longer. They packed what little they could carry and joined the thousands of other refugees fleeing Darwin. Jimmy left his mirror games behind forever. He never flashed another signal. He never stood on that cliff again. And something strange happened after Jimmy left. Japanese bombing accuracy began to decline. Not dramatically, but noticeably. By mid-1942, their hit rate had dropped to around 65%. They still caused damage with each raid, but they were not achieving the devastating precision of those first attacks. Intelligence officers noticed the change, but could not explain it. They did not know about Jimmy. They did not know about the mirrors. They had no idea that the absence of a teenage boy playing on a cliff could affect enemy bombing accuracy. The oil storage tanks at Stokes Hill Wharf became a particularly grim example of the raid's impact. Those tanks, sitting in a direct sightline from Jimmy's old signaling spot, were hit in 4 separate raids over the course of 1942. Each time they were rebuilt, the Japanese found them again with ease. Each time they exploded, more fuel was lost, more workers were killed, more of Australia's war effort was set back. The tank's position, so easily referenced from that clifftop point, made them almost impossible to defend. Military intelligence did not discover the truth about the mirror signals until late 1943. Allied forces had captured several Japanese pilots and naval officers after battles in the Solomon Islands. During routine interrogations, one officer mentioned the signal lights that had helped guide the Darwin raids. He talked about how valuable that ground intelligence had been. He described the location in detail, the timing of the signals, the way multiple lights had appeared to coordinate with each other. The interrogators were confused. Australia had no agents working with the Japanese. There had been no collaborators, no spies, no traders sending signals to the enemy. They investigated the location the officer described. They found the cliff at East Point. They interviewed people who had lived in the area before the evacuation. And slowly, piece by piece, they began to understand what had really happened. The final count of deaths across all Darwin raids reached 292 Australians killed. Hundreds more were wounded. Thousands lost their homes. The city was nearly abandoned, its population dropping from 5,000 to just a few hundred hardy souls who refused to leave. The economic damage ran into millions of pounds. Ships that should have carried supplies to troops fighting in New Guinea went to the bottom of Darwin Harbour instead. Aircraft that should have defended Australia burned on the ground, and at the center of it all, invisible and unknowing, was a 15-year-old boy who just wanted to play with a mirror and pretend he was important. The discovery of what had really happened at East Point changed military thinking in ways that reached far beyond Darwin. After the war ended in 1945, the Australian military began reviewing everything they had learned from those terrible years. They studied every raid, every attack, every failure of defense. When they came to understand how innocent mirror flashes had been mistaken for enemy signals, they realized they needed new rules to prevent anything like it from ever happening again. By 1947, the military had established strict protocols about civilian light sources in strategic areas. Any reflective object near a military base or important port had to be controlled. Mirrors, polished metal, even car windshields parked in certain locations became subject to regulations. Coastal observation posts were given specific guidelines about what kinds of equipment volunteers could use. The rules seemed excessive to many people. After all, the war was over. But the military never forgot how a simple mirror had become a navigation beacon for enemy bombers. These protocols spread beyond Australia. Other nations learned about the Darwin incident through shared intelligence reports. The British military updated their coastal defense manuals. The Americans added sections to their base security procedures. By the early 1950s, military installations around the world had adopted similar rules. All because a teenager in Darwin had played with his mother's compact mirror without knowing anyone was watching. Jimmy Doolan never learned any of this. He never knew that his mirror games had any connection to the raids that destroyed his hometown. The military kept the information classified for decades. They worried that revealing the truth might harm morale or create panic about how easy it was to accidentally help the enemy. So Jimmy lived his entire life believing he had simply been a kid playing on cliffs during the war, nothing more. After the family evacuated to Adelaide, Jimmy tried to move on with his life. He finished school in 1944 and immediately enlisted in the army, finally old enough to serve like his father. But the war in the Pacific ended before he saw any combat. He spent 2 years in occupation duty in Japan, ironically living in the same country whose pilots had used his signals. He never made the connection. He came home in 1947, married a girl he had known before the war, and spent 40 years working as a telegraph operator for the Postal Service. He had children and grandchildren. He lived a quiet, ordinary life. He died in 1987 at the age of 60, never knowing that he had been part of one of World War II's strangest stories. His mother's mirror, the one that had started everything, disappeared somewhere during the evacuation from Darwin. Maybe it was lost in the chaos of packing. Maybe it fell from a bag during the long journey south. Or maybe Jimmy's mother threw it away, wanting nothing that reminded her of those terrible days. Nobody knows. The mirror that had flashed signals visible for 15 nautical miles vanished into history like so many other small objects caught up in the war. The truth only began to emerge in the 1990s, when historians gained access to Japanese military archives that had been sealed for decades. Researchers studying the Darwin raids found detailed reports from reconnaissance pilots describing the light signals they had observed. The reports included precise coordinates, times, and descriptions that matched East Point exactly. They found planning documents that showed how Japanese officers had incorporated these supposed signals into their attack strategy. They found post-raid assessments that credited the ground intelligence with improving bombing accuracy. Australian researchers began connecting the pieces. They interviewed elderly residents who remembered the war years in Darwin. Several people recalled seeing young boys playing with mirrors on the cliffs before the evacuation. Local historians tracked down school records and found Jimmy's name. They contacted his surviving children, who knew their father had lived in Darwin as a teenager, but knew little else about that time. His family had no idea their father's childhood games might have played any role in the tragedy. The story finally became public in 1998 when a historian published a detailed account in a military history journal. The revelation shocked Australia. Some people refused to believe it. How could something so innocent have such terrible consequences? Others saw it as a tragedy of miscommunication and confirmation bias. The Japanese had been so desperate for ground intelligence that they saw patterns where none existed. They turned random flashes from a child's toy into a spy network that existed only in their imagination. Modern military operations have learned harsh lessons from stories like Jimmy's. Contemporary doctrine emphasizes what is called signature management, which means controlling all forms of unintentional signals that might give information to the enemy. Soldiers are taught about electronic signatures from radios and phones. They learn about thermal signatures from vehicles and equipment. They understand visual signatures from movement and light. The goal is to prevent any accidental communication with people who might be watching. This concept has become even more important in the age of drones and satellites. Today's battlefields are watched from above by cameras far more sophisticated than anything that existed in World War II. A reflection off a watch face a pattern in how vehicles are parked, even the way soldiers walk can provide intelligence to observers. Military forces spend enormous amounts of time and money trying to control these unintended signals, all because history has shown again and again that enemies will find patterns and meaning in anything they see, whether those patterns are real or not. The Darwin story also teaches something deeper about how wars are fought and how mistakes happen. In the confusion of combat, when lives depend on making quick decisions with incomplete information, people see what they expect to see. The Japanese pilots expected to find agents helping them. So when they saw regular flashes of light from the coast, they interpreted those flashes as deliberate signals. They built an entire intelligence picture around something that was never real. Their minds filled in the gaps, created a story that made sense, and acted on that story with deadly consequences. This same pattern repeats throughout history. During the Cold War, both sides saw enemy missiles and bomber attacks in weather patterns and computer glitches. In modern conflicts, social media posts and cell phone data get misinterpreted as terrorist communications. Innocent people get targeted because some algorithm decided their behavior matched a pattern. The technology changes, but the fundamental problem remains the same. When people are looking for threats, they will find them everywhere, even in the most innocent actions. Jimmy Doolin's story reminds us that the most consequential acts of war are often the ones never intended as such. A mirror in the hands of a bored teenager became a beacon for destruction, not through malice or stupidity or even carelessness. It happened through the tragic combination of innocence, timing, and desperate men searching for certainty in chaos. A child played games on a cliff. Pilots saw those games from miles away and built meaning from them. And hundreds of people died because two groups of humans who never met and never spoke misunderstood each other across an impossible distance. That is the real lesson. In war, there are no small actions. Everything means something to someone. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not a bomb or a gun, but simply being seen at the wrong time by the wrong eyes looking for the wrong thing.